Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a problem. In America, the population of prisons has quadrupled to just under 1% of the total population. That is about 2.4 million people in prisons. At the same time, we lack enough research subjects. People in prisons are affected by diseases like HIV and hepatitis C in a disproportionate manner when compared to the rest of the population. These are two diseases which suffer from a lack of research subjects. Now, at the same time, Dr. Gilbert from the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, told the Spiegel, which is a German newspaper, that medications which protect different treatments against Ebola will have been known since 5 years, but they cannot be used because the trials on humans were too expensive and also did not have enough supporters. Now here we see two problems. A problem of having too many prisoners and another problem of lacking sufficient research subjects. Now we as Team Swaziland, we see a world with fewer prisoners and also in our research subjects as a very good thing. That is why this house would allow prisoners to volunteer for drug trials in exchange for life sentences. Now drug trials or clinical trials are prospective biomedical or behavioral research studies on human subjects that are designed to answer specific questions about the biomedical or behavioral interventions of humans. Now the drugs that will be qualified for these clinical trials would only be referred to as medicinal drugs. And life sentence, on the other hand, is when a prisoner is granted a lighter jail sentence than the one they want to have. Now we as side proposition have come up with a model or a technique to tackle the issue I have identified earlier in the context. Firstly, we would set up a commission that would monitor the drug trials and then equate it to some reduction of prison time or fines. Now we think that the members of this commission will include medical experts, a retired judge, a prison advocate, and a representative from pharmaceuticals. And we think that all the meetings that will be held by this commission would be open to the general public. Secondly, we would limit the number of times prisoners would be allowed to volunteer in such a way that the maximum sentence reductions prisoners would get would be 3 years. Thirdly, prisoners would only be allowed to volunteer after having spent 6 months in prison. This is because we believe that this time is enough to allow prisoners to familiarize themselves with the prison environment. And also, this shall be looked upon by the commission. Fourthly, absolutely no clinical trials will be held exclusively for prisoners. The majority of the drug trial volunteers would be prisoners, and then the minority would have to be non-prisoners as well. And also, the prisoners would not be paid for having volunteered in this drug trial. The only form of payment they would get is the sentence reduction. Only the non-prisoners would have to be paid for it. And lastly, the Institutional Review Board, which is a body set up involved in the biomedical research on humans, would approve everything that is the methods that are going to be used for this drug trials. On to our arguments. I, as the first speaker, will be talking about how we believe that our model is consistent with the aims of the criminal justice system. Secondly, I will also be speaking on how through our model prisoners can commit informed consent. And lastly, I will also be talking on the benefits to medical research. Now, Siguse here will be talking about the benefits toward the prisoner. Now, on to my first argument on how we believe that our model is consistent with the aims of the criminal justice system. Now, we think that the state does its right to punish from harm to social good. Now, often, when the state sees that there is an overall good in reducing a sentence for the society, then the state does it. Examples would include the use of pre-trial negotiations to trade important information for lighter sentences, whereby people grant information to help in a case in exchange for a lighter sentence. Another example would include the use of in plea bargains as well as the statutes of limitation. We think that through this and within the confines of the aims of the criminal justice system, it may be rehabilitation, deterrence, as well as retribution. Our model aims to find the best balance between these and the utility of having fewer prisoners and more clinical trial volunteers. Yes, sir.
Would you allow a drug company to threaten someone with 6 months in prison if he doesn't go for a clinical trial?
Thank you very much, sir, for that point of information. Now here, there is no form of coercion or force. Here, prisoners are allowed to volunteer for the drug trials after having spent 6 months in prison. We think that the 6 months in prison is enough for the prisoners to familiarize themselves with this prison environment before they are allowed to volunteer for the drug trials. To volunteer, so which means that they choose willingly and are not forced or coerced to choose. Now, on to our second argument and how we believe that through our model, prisoners can give an informed consent. Firstly, we believe that prisoners can give an informed consent through relevant information. True, the prisoners would not be granted all the information, but they will be granted enough information to help them make an informed consent. And they will also be told about the risk and in turn must demonstrate their understanding of the risk. And we think that because prisoners have gone through processes such as psychological screening, we know a lot more about them than we do about the rest of the population, which is why we think that they can give an informed consent. Again, because also in an overwhelming majority of cases, the risk of clinical trials are not that great. Why? Because only 1 in 1,000 chemical compounds that are ever made actually make it to the clinical testing phase. This is because loads of experimentation and studies they still have to be tested on animals before they are even tested on humans. And we think that because of this, the risks are scraped off as much as possible, allowing prisoners, reducing the majority of risks that would be there. And again, because of a lot of experimentation is investigating the efficacy of the drugs as well as the dosage of the drugs versus the safety of it. And again, pharmaceuticals have a great incentive to ensure that the best drug available is out there. Healthy ones would not do their reputation much good because they want to sell the drugs to people. Because they want to sell the drugs to people, they want to make sure that the risks are as little as possible. And again, it will put control against abuse. This means that people have to be treated the same. Since we understand in our model that we will be using prisoners as well as non-prisoners. So in any cases of harm or abuse, the non-prisoners are better at voicing out their complaints, which ensures good treatment for everyone, the non-prisoners as well as the prisoners. And lastly, last argument on what are the benefits to medical research. Firstly, it makes the production of medicines quicker, because a major constraint at present is finding a sufficient number of volunteers. I will give you 2 examples of drugs, Vios and Bextra. These are 2 pain-relieving drugs that actually went to the market and were later pulled out of it because of a lack of test patients in their studies. Again, it makes the production of medicines cheaper. Since in most cases, the pharmaceuticals would have to reconcile money that they would have spent in clinical trials. And since because of that, we as a professor said that the majority will have to pay, thus allowing medicines to become cheaper. Now, it is for these reasons that's why we, psychologists, should thereby beg you to propose.
Proposition's regression to the Victorian notion that prisoners are mere subjects for our experiments. We champion the principle that prisoners should not be forced to buy their freedom with their health and their dignity. 3 arguments. 1. We protect prisoners from exploitation. 2. We create safer drugs. And 3. We support rehabilitation and reintegration. My second speaker will talk to you about that. What's our policy? 1. We would not allow prisoners to volunteer for drug trials in exchange for lighter sentences. 2. We support other means of testing drugs, like computer modeling and big data, which has reduced the need for human beings in drug tests. We think the fact that class very often drugs by the time they reach the clinical testing stage are already safe is proof that these things work. Third, we support the status quo, where companies only give volunteers compensation for their transport and their medical costs, not for taking the drug. 4. We support a plethora of rehabilitative options for prisoners and making prisons better and safer. And 5th, sentencing, no, will already account for mitigatory circumstances and parole for good behavior will still exist. Before our arguments, 3 points of rebuttal on criminal justice, on informed choice, and on medical benefits.
Sir?
No. First, criminal justice. They tell us that the only proof that justice can be flexible is parole and plea bargaining. You see, pre-trial negotiations and plea bargaining are different in 2 ways. 1, these don't cause massive harm to the prisoner, which I'll demonstrate later. 2, these don't similarly harm society. I'll demonstrate that later as well. Moreover, if they believe in this principle, then would they allow a really rich person to give $1 million, no thank you, to fund the police force or to fund prisons and create a social good and get out of a jail sentence? We don't think they'll explain that, no thank you. Moreover, if they truly believe in this principle and that prisons are overcrowded, we say, why do they limit that policy to only 3 years? No, they should have it as an option for prisoners at all times. No, so we don't think this point of criminal justice stands. They forget their own principle. Second, on informed consent. We say, when they tell us you are familiarized and can volunteer after 6 months, what they mean is that after 6 months, you are inured to the brutality and regimentation of a prison. That is why it is a false choice that does not exist. You do not choose willingly. Moreover, we say you don't get the information they talk to you about. They say we'll set up an institutional review board. 1. This board with information, we say prisoners won't report. So we say that non-prisoners may report, but the problems non-prisoners face are very different from the problems prisoners face as exploitation in prisons. Second, even if they do, we say there is very little scrutiny of prisons. We don't think it massively changes. No. Why? Because prisons are built to be as excluded from the public as possible. The whole concept is to separate prisoner from society. Finally, we say bribery and corruption occurs in prisons all the time. They've not showed us how they will deal with this. No. Finally, they said, we will monitor the drug trial and then determine your sentence reduction. This implies that the prisoner at the point he volunteers for the drug trial does not know how much his sentence will be reduced by. So he can't make a proper cost-benefit analysis if this review board will first review the results of that trial before reducing sentences. They don't give prisoners information. Finally, we say the risks are massive. No, we say that's why they have so many checks and balances in the first place. We don't think that's true. Last point on medical benefits. We rejected the idea that there are not enough subjects. 1, because as they consider themselves, we've become very good at using non-human ways of testing drugs. But 2, because in actual fact, on a purely empirical level, we do have enough subjects. The NHS in the UK says that they have over 20,000 more subjects than they actually need. Moreover, we see that for the very specific viruses they talk about, like Ebola, we would have prisoners with Ebola. We don't think that is true. We don't think they get medical benefits. I'll explore that further in my case. So, first argument. Our principle is that we protect prisoners from grievous harm. See, the state steps in to stop you, hold on a moment, from making harmful choices, especially when under duress. And that's why you can't work in unsafe conditions, even if you live in poverty. Yes?
Why do we release prisoners even without the policy sometimes early?
Because they show good behavior, which indicates rehabilitation. We think that is completely different from them being massively exploited. I will explain why that happens now. Why are prisoners under duress? And this continues to clash with the argument about choice. 1. Because prisons are systemically regimented and dehumanizing. You do the same thing every day. You never get to see your loved ones. You live in fear of being attacked by fellow inmates. See, when offered early release from this daily brutality of a prison versus the abstract, distant possibility of some health harms, say prisoners are effectively worse in the going for drug trials. If, as we point out, a drug company can't say we will lock you in a cellar for 6 months unless you go for this drug trial, we don't see why it's any different for that company to say we will let you go from the cellar early 6 months unless you go for this drug trial. We don't think there's a meaningful difference there. Second, because prisons institutionally enforce a culture of obedience. Even mess hall infractions can lead to a loss of exercise privileges or solitary confinement if deemed severe. So prisoners learn to never question authority. So when prison wardens and doctors, figures of authority, actively encourage you to go for a drug trial, prisoners have little ability to say no. So prisoners take huge health risks they never conceived of. So, see, this is especially harmful because prison magnifies these risks. Why? Because prisoners who have pre-existing conditions may very well lie to take part in a drug trial because they want to reduce their sentence. So either they stop taking vital medication in a bid for freedom, or they secretly keep taking medication on the side, which causes huge harms when the drugs interact. For example, hydrocodone and carisoprodol cause liver failure when taken together. Those are harms they subject prisoners to. Second, because prisoners almost never seek legal recourse. That undermines the entire policy. In prison, you keep your head down. You don't complain because you don't want the unwanted attention of guards and other prisoners. So prisoners inherently don't use legal channels even if they exist. And that's why in the US, only 7% of prison abuse cases are reported to the prison law office. So prisoners are incredibly vulnerable to exploitation by corporations seeking to cut costs. No, by either cutting doctor-patient ratios, by cutting the stock of emergency drugs they keep on site. We think they harm prisoners and effectively force them into taking on these harms. No. Second argument, we create safer drugs. We say their drug trial creates unsafe drugs. Why? Because as they've conceded, prison demographics are really different from population demographics. This skews trial results because different groups react differently to drugs. So for example, Hispanics and African Americans respond less to drugs with protein as a substrate. In America, unfortunately, Hispanics and blacks form the majority of the prison population. So drug effects in the general population are often much more pronounced than would be in the prison population. And this is compounded by unsanitary prison conditions, meaning that drug results are unreliable, creating unsafe drugs. And this is especially because their policy systemically makes corporations only use prison populations, a vast majority of them become prison populations. Why? Because companies want to maximize profit. And using prisoners is just a lot cheaper. You don't have to pay for their transport, for their medical costs, to compensate for work hours lost. So you give them a very large pool of captive volunteers, and therefore companies systemically don't seek non-prison volunteers. And even if they do, it's a tiny minority, which is not a representative sample. So, making prisoners the main subjects of a drug trial distorts the results, because approved drugs are in fact ineffective and unsafe, and they put those on shelves. On our side, companies find better ways to test drugs. We've already found ways to model new drugs by extrapolating from other chemicals in the known population. We say this progress only continues when they don't give companies an easy way out. So, because in principle, they exploit prisoners and harm them, and second, because in practice, they hurt medical progress and don't uphold their own principle, I'm so proud to stand in opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, apparently the strategy that Team Singapore is going to come at this debate with is misrepresenting our ideas. And throughout my building and rebuttal, I'm going to show you whether consistently fail to do even that effectively. So I'm going to base this on three arguments. I'm going to base my rebuilding on three arguments. Firstly, the criminal justice system and its aims. Secondly, let's talk about consent. And then lastly, medical research, before I move on to my substantive argumentation, which are the direct benefits to the prisoner, some of which are going to directly clash with some of the substantive brought up here by Singapore in their first speech. So let's start with the criminal justice system. We think that our policy is justified because it not only works with the current aims of the criminal justice system, but we think it actually improves them because it improves social utility. We think that medical research is very, very important for people who are living with things like Alzheimer's, who are living with things like cancer. So they come up here and they stand up and they say, and we gave them precedent for how government already does this, when we can demonstrate that social utility is advanced by letting prisoners out first. They said that, well, there's a difference between plea bargains, statutes of limitation, and trading important information. They said that, well, you have to prove two necessary conditions for this. They said you have to show that there's not going to be a harm to that person directly, and they said you're going to have to show that society doesn't suffer. The society point I'm going to deal with with one sentence. We don't think that letting someone early because they provided you with information makes them any safer to engage with society. So we don't think that the status quo that they stand for better represents society in any way. Then they talked about the harm to the person. They said, we believe, Mr. Speaker, that after 3 years of waiting, you are able to risk associate. And as I move on to my argumentation about consent, I'm going to show you why prisoners are still able of making good decisions for themselves in light of their circumstances. So we think that there are three necessary conditions for consent. First, access access to information. Secondly, risk association, and then firstly, abuse and protection. So they came up here and they said, well, there's a huge risk that pharmaceutical companies are going to coerce us. Coercion, basically, Mr. Speaker, is when one's choices are narrowed unfavorably to the point that if you don't comply, your life is worse than when you do. We have three problems with this. Firstly, you're being offered a reward as opposed to being offered a punishment. So your life after you don't comply is exactly the same as before. We're not punishing you if you don't take part in a medical trial. Secondly, we think that the fact that people outside in society still volunteer is a good principle to demonstrate that people are still able to choose drug trials for their own benefit. So we think that this idea that they brought to us, that choosing medical trial to participate in a drug trial is inherently demonstrative of the fact that you are irrational, is wrong, because we allow people outside in society who aren't subjected to prison to engage. So we don't think that prison necessarily makes you less capable of engaging with society and choosing whether or not to participate in drug trials. They said that next, we actually harm pharmaceutical institutions. They said that the pharmaceutical companies are going to be incentivized to make conditions bad and blah, blah, blah. We think, Mr. Speaker, that the simple fact of the matter is, when we engage in a drug trial, the point is to prove efficacy. We can only prove efficacy if we remove all other variables. And as I move on to my argumentation later on about how the prisoner is going to benefit, we think that what's actually going to happen is that pharmaceutical companies are going to be incentivized to ensure that people get enough sleep, to ensure that people are get good nutrition. Why? Because these are the only conditions that need to be removed in order to ensure that the drug trials are actually efficacious. We think that pharmaceutical companies are employed and engaged in an industry based on trust. So they don't want to just go out and kill people because that would impugn their reputation in society. And then lastly, they said that, well, what actually going to happen is that prisons are made to be repressive. We think, Mr. Speaker, they're made to be repressive in order to deal with the harm to society. But we think that you're actually going to have a rise in things like prison literature. We're going to be able to document what actually happens in society better. And this is a good thing for prison conditions in itself. Secondly, the fact that people outside of prisons are engaging is also going to ensure that if drugs aren't working, those people are able to take up the necessary legal conditions against pharmaceutical industry. So even if prisoners are being oppressed, the people outside in society aren't. Therefore, we think that those people are more liable to go out and engage with the system. But as I move on to my third point of rebuilding, I'll take your points up.
People locked in prisons don't face the same massive daily pressures and exploitation that people in prisons do, and so that choice is not due and that reporting isn't.
And that's exactly my point. The fact that they aren't susceptible to this pressure and yet still choose to do this shows that it is actually a rational choice. Thank you for that point very much, sir. So let's look at the benefits to medical research. We think that medical research is going to benefit from efficiency. They didn't argue this. They argued us on cost effective. They didn't argue us on cost effective. They said that, well, we told you that we don't have to pay people. This makes Chinese drugs cheaper. And what we think, to add another layer of analysis, we think that this is cost on to the people who are able to consume it better. So then they said that, well, there's another problem as we move on to diversity. They said that we have a problem because prison systems tend not to be more representative. We think that in places like America, the prison population is a large majority, and even outside in the normal populace, the Hispanics are a large majority of society, and yet only 1% of them take part in drug trials. We think that when you engage with people in the prison system, you're actually going to get better results. They talked about big data. Microsoft actually goes through 3 terabytes every 2 seconds of big data information. The reason we're not relying on big data is because it's not efficient. We still have lots of problems in society. If big data works, we wouldn't need to test drugs, and medicines like Proven would still work. So I move on to my substantive argumentation. Let's talk about the benefits to the prisoner. Mr. Speaker, we think that the prisoner is going to benefit in 3 ways from our policy. We think that we're going to have access to new medication. We also see that we think that pharmaceutical companies are going to be incentivized to make conditions in prison better. And thirdly, we're going to have fewer prisoners to deal with at one point in time. So we think that individual prisoners are also going to benefit. So let's start to pursue this question of access to information. I'll take the points up.
If social utility is so important, why would you let a rich murderer stay 6 months in jail and they pay $2 million to refurbish a police force?
We think that what's important here, Mr. Speaker, is the simple fact of the matter that if you are a real danger to society, you won't be spending a short enough time in society to be let out after 3 years. If you're going to go out and kill 1 million people, we don't think you're going to get a trial. We don't think you're going to get a sentence worth 3 years. So we don't think particularly dangerous people in society are going to be let out even under our case. So as I move on to the benefits to the prisoner, Mr. Speaker, starting with this idea of access to medication, a lot of people outside of society choose to participate in drug trials, not for the financial incentive, but for the simple fact that medications that are readily available on the market haven't been working to their effect. To this, we see two benefits to the prisoner. Firstly, they're going to be able to engage with medicines that work and aren't available on the market, so they're going to be able to relieve their own suffering. And then secondly, because of the cost effectiveness going to be removed, that my first speaker talked about, we think that they're also going to be able to access this once they're generally out in the market. Secondly, we also think we're going to see better prison conditions. Why? Because of the aims of pharmaceutical companies to prove the efficacy of medication. In order to do this, they're going to have to ensure that the medicine that they're putting out to society actually works. So we think that things that generally hinder drug trials are things like nutrition, because people aren't eating enough. Therefore, we don't get actual results. Pharmaceutical companies are going to be insured and incentivized to ensure that people eat enough so that they can ensure efficacy. We think that our policy actually guarantees better medicine efficacy because we're able to watch over the prisoners better than we are able to watch over people in the general public. And lastly, with less people in the prison system to deal with, we think that it's going to be safer. We're going to have less crowding because we're going to have a lower prisoner to warder ratio, which is going to make security how much easier thing to deal with. So because, Mr. Speaker, the prisoners are rational and this policy benefits them, as society, it actually gains benefit. We beg you, Mr. Speaker, to propose the motion.
We find it suspicious they tell us prisoners are free from coercion like all of us out here. But somehow we need an additionally strong incentive like releasing them early from jail so that enough people can volunteer. So with that, I'm going to ask two questions. First, does that problem actually exist? Secondly, even if it does it warrant exploitation? First, does that problem actually exist? This is important because the fact that there are not enough volunteers justifies their entire principle of social good. So if we can prove that they only gain nevertheless benefit, then their principle falls. Our first response is this: the problem is much less severe than they tell us to be. From 2008 to 2014, the number of human volunteers for drug trials in the UK increased from 200,000 to 600,000, and you only need 600,000 volunteers for a successful drug trial. So the first level, the problem doesn't exist. But even if it does, we have other ways of ameliorating it. Pfizer has developed a super impository test enhanced matrix system, which is used by drug companies to test drug components on tissue culture instead of humans. This is an accuracy rate of 95%, and today is used in more than 50% of drug tests. So even if there are not enough volunteers, our answer is we don't need them as much now. They never took down our counter model of computer modeling and big data. But okay, let's clash with the principle of plea bargaining and pre-trial negotiation. We told you it's different in two ways. First, because the harm to individual is much less severe. What happens is when you go for plea bargaining or pre-trial negotiation, you're offered witness protection. You change your identity. You move to a different country. This is different from being stuck in a prison, having been exploited every day because you're forced into a culture of obedience. Secondly, you don't pose a risk to society precisely because you are now removed from it. As they consider in their policy, majority of drugs will not be tested on principles. This was stated in their first speaker. So we think that is precisely why it harms society, because the medicines you get are not representative and useful. But it never came close to answering our point of information on whether you will allow a millionaire to buy his way out of a prison sentence. Their only response is, if you are a danger to society, you shouldn't be released early. If you listen carefully, their policy doesn't actually state who this will apply to. This means rapists can get out scot-free. This means murderers cannot serve a sentence and get out after familiarizing themselves after 6 months. Their own principle is inconsistent. No, but finally, attention in their case. If the risk is not so great as they tell us, so prisoners aren't subject to massive duress, why exactly do you need such a harsh, drastic measure to cut their prison sentence? We suggest precisely a huge incentive they want to push to us today that suggests the risks are so egregious that their policy is unjustified. But even if we accept that there's a problem with dearth of volunteers, they don't actually solve it. you change the incentive, and as they conceded, for drug companies to cater mainly to prisoners. You allow other diseases that prisoners often have to interfere with trial results. So there's a problem of underdetermination. You can't tell if trial results are indicative of a drug success. All of which is a touch analysis, so no, they never successfully proved their problem. Second question then, even if the problem exists, is exploitation justified? Here we'll clash with the main idea of consent. First, we think that prisoners tend to be some of the most, unfortunately, poorly educated ones in our society. They have the least knowledge of legal rights. Even if they do have knowledge, they have less access to legal rights. They can't conceivably hire a lawyer to fight for them, not when they're downtrodden in a dirty prison cell. No, prisoners are also isolated from other members. Unlike you and me, they can't talk this over calmly with their families. They can't talk this over calmly with their friends. They can't talk this over calmly with their teachers. All of which means your consent is significantly reduced. Finally, it told us that pharmaceuticals will be transparent. No, pharmaceuticals tend to downplay the risk. They tell you might feel nauseous after a day. You might feel dizzy after a day. Maybe you and I can spot the massive incongruity in that statement. But for prisoners who so badly want to get out of jail as they told us, no, we don't think they'll be able to do so. And here they try to conflate our principle. They told us that people outside can choose rationally as well. Yes, people outside choose rationally because they are unforced to a culture of obedience. They are unforced to live with the reality that if they don't volunteer for a drug trial, they're going to spend the rest of their life in prison. No, but finally, we'd like to point out that they conceded themselves that social good is not an absolute. That's why you limit the number of times that a prisoner can volunteer. That's why a prisoner can only volunteer after 6 months. All of which are principal concessions that social good does not justify exploitation. So with that, we've taken down their principles entirely. I'll now be moving to a substantive note, which will further clash with the material brought up in the second speaker. By substantive is about how this discuss rehabilitation and reintegration in 3 ways. First, you prevent judges from meaningfully exercising discretion to facilitate rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is often difficult and uncertain. So when sentences are constructed, judges have the discretion to exercise and consider this uncertainty. Hold on a minute. That's why mechanisms like early release and parole are based on giving judges sufficient discretion based on a prisoner's behavior over time. But crucially, rehabilitation is a gradual process spanning numerous milestones. You slowly relax restrictions so parole officers can observe whether you can use those privileges responsibly before you extend new ones. For instance, drug offenders go through therapy to break their neurochemical addictions as well as counseling, but both require a fixed and predictable period of time. Yes?
Ma'am, does the use of big data reduce the risk to the prisoner?
Yes, because the prisoner is not subject to exploitation, he's not forced to make a choice under coercion. Yes, that's your point of it. So what exactly are the implications this has? This means that a prisoner in the midst of a rehabilitation program can decide at a crucial juncture to cut the sentence short and leave even if this program is incomplete. This means that an unrepentant prisoner can be released early even if it's a danger to society as the proposition tells us. No, even though staying in prison will mean completing counseling so that he might recognize the errors of his ways. Here is where I'm going to clash with the second speaker's argument about how this benefits prisoners. First, about providing medicines for prisoners. Okay, if we think that these are medicines in the preliminary stages as they somehow characterized to us today, then we think it's unfair that they're giving them such medicines which haven't been completed testing yet. Secondly, about prisoners' health, because pharmaceuticals want to keep them healthy. Okay, then the logical implication is for prisoners who don't volunteer for drug trials, they are still made to suffer. So your side doesn't improve prisoners' welfare entirely. No. Last, about reducing overcrowding. Our answer is simple. If your problem is with overcrowding, then this policy should not discriminate between volunteers and not. You should apply this universally to all prisoners instead of only volunteers. We think the other side allows us to take an unconscionable principle start. No. Secondly, allowing prisoners to take up this policy inhibits their chances of turning over a new leaf. Because unlike things like community work, where you need to make an active commitment on the part of prisoners to repent and to make a sustained contribution to community, or only volunteering for drug trials may appear noble. But unfortunately, it's a one-off act that lacks the consistent reinforcement of moral codes that community service desires. Furthermore, it's a passive act that does not amount to devoting your time and effort every single week to repay your moral debt to society. So they inhibit genuine rehabilitation. But finally, they hurt reintegration. Society is already discriminatory towards ex-convicts. That's why they are often denied employment opportunities. But now, prisoners will be seen as insincere about making amends. You'll be seen as only selfishly concerned about reducing their sentences. This is unlike parole because volunteering for drug trials would be seen as an economic tool for prisoners to buy their way out of serving their sentences. Therefore, society becomes less accepting of prisoners who hurt rehabilitation and reintegration. So we stand by the base principle proudly that we should never force prisoners to buy their freedom with health and dignity.
Ladies and gentlemen, side proposition does not try to reinvent the wheel. We are just connecting two problems of society, not enough people for medical trials, and too many prisoners in prison. And we apply different principles that already exist, meaning giving people an incentive to volunteer for drug trials, and releasing prisoners early if they provide a certain social utility. We connect these two problems in order to solve them both, and we connect these two principles because we believe they already exist in society, were applied over decades, and worked pretty well for everybody. So what does this debate come down to? Is there still a choice for a prisoner? Can a prisoner actually make a choice? This is the first question I would like to ask this week. Secondly, are the principles we are proposing actually upheld? And thirdly, will it harm the prisoners? Can the prisoner make this choice? We have three ideas that were debated. Does the prisoner buy his freedom? Does he have enough knowledge? And is there a culture of obedience? First thing, to buy their freedom, we believe it's not buying. Why? Because we're giving an incentive, not a harm. Does your employer say he's going to take $2,000 away from you if you don't come to work? That is what they are representing. They are saying they locked him 6 months in a prison cell. No, we say no. We give an incentive, meaning the employer tells you he will give you something. Meaning, if you are not doing this, if you're saying the risk of your work is high, if you're saying the risk of drug trials is high, you're not going to do so. We believe this is not a new principle. This is exactly what is happening in society all the time, and it's also what is happening outside of trials. They're saying you pay these people, so they go for trials, and this is completely legal. If they are saying that this practice should not be standing, they should also oppose paying people on all, because apparently you are forcing them with them giving them a positive incentive. Then knowledge. We say, well, we apply the same principles as outside. We are saying we might drug trials as they are existed outside of in the prisons, but inside as well. So meaning they actually get the information they need. As said, we are not reinventing anything new. These principles are existent and they are working right now. Furthermore, obedience. And I think this is kind of a funny argument, because what we are talking about is that we are releasing criminals out of society, that we are releasing people that are not reintegrated already. But if there's obedience to authority, how are these people not reintegrated? I think Singapore is rebutting themselves. They can either say they are obedient as authority in every case, or they can say, well, these people are not reintegrated. But both at the same time doesn't work. And I will back actually to the point of obedience in the last point, harming prisoners. So we believe actually these people can make the choice and improve this. Moving on to the principal argument.
Information.
No, thank you. We think there are 3 points. Firstly, that we actually harm this principle to say only 3 years for everybody? Is this drug better afterwards? And is there a risk for the prisoners? So we say, well, basically these principles are already existent. They already brought us examples of rapists, they brought us examples of the dangerous criminals that are going to be released. We believe these people already have so large sentences that they're not going to be released early. A mass murderer might get 20 years. Rapists in many cases might get 12 years. a reduction by 3 years would not actually harm the deterrence of these prisoners. Also because judges already include things like that when they give their sentence. They know that the majority of the prisoners are actually released early because of good behavior in prison. Meaning, as I said, we're not inventing anything new. Judges already include that they are going to release early. Also, we believe they're not going to be released straight away. Why? Because people that are actually, they have to stay half a year in prison for minor crimes, and people that commit bigger crimes will stay still long sentences.
Point of information.
Oh, please try me, sir.
Okay, so would you now let the rich man pay $1 million to reduce his sentence by 3 years or 4 years? He'll still stay there for 50
We believe he doesn't, but we believe this is a principle that is already existent, and we believe it is not directly connected to debate. Why? Because people buy the time out of prison, and that's a matter of fact. It's true. Why do they do that? Because they provide social utility. We believe if there is a risk that you're going to commit the same crime again, most legal systems provide ways to keep you in prison. As said, this is not connected to debate because these people are already in prison, they provide good service, they provide good behavior, as said was by our opposition, so therefore they will release early. Is the drug better? And we have two arguments. Firstly, there are enough people already. Secondly, they are not representative.
Information.
We brought you examples where there were actually not enough trials. For example, the Ebola medications are known since 5 years. Because these testings are so expensive, because it's hard to get actually people to test them, these medications are not tested. People die every day in Western Africa because they did not implement a policy like that earlier in order to make testing easier. Then they talked about it's the representative. And we say there are clear legal boundaries how a test is created. These legal boundaries are existing and they're also applying for our model. And these legal boundaries describe that the trial has to be representative. But sometimes we need special people. Especially for Ebola, we need the majority of black people. If you could accept their argument that black people react different to medications than white people, which we believe is only the case in a minority of the trial. So in sometimes we really need this minority group in order to test medication for them. Especially because a majority of the people that volunteer for drug trials right now are white people. Because they have better access to like these information. So please come, sir.
We've told you that they make companies use almost exclusively prison populations, which as considered a minority, and then don't affect the general population.
We don't believe this is happening because there are actually legal boundaries. First, he said there must be a certain percentage of people from outside the prison in order to have better contact with people in prison. These percentages should be provided by the Commission because we believe we don't have the medical skills to decide on this. Furthermore, we believe that the study has to be representative by legal boundaries already given. So moving on, so after we prove actually drugs speak better, will there be actually a risk because of the culture of obedience? And we believe this is actually not the case. Why? We see that people normally fall back after the time of prison. In some cases, they commit crimes again. And that is a risk we have to face. And
point of information.
But this actually shows that there is no culture of obedience. As people still don't look up to the prison guardians, to the state they oppose when they actually commit their crime. Moving on to the last point, how in the prison. There are 2 points. They said these drugs are risky. But then they talked about effective other testings, about effective animal testing, about effective computer testing. We say normally you have to do every pre-trial possible before you go to humans. Meaning if these models are so effective, the drugs are not risky because these models are so effective. We believe human testing is often a legal barrier, meaning even if we could, and we don't believe this, prove with computer models 100% that the drug is working, the legal barriers still say you need human testing. Meaning you need human testing to bring it on the market. Human testing is still a necessity, even if these methods were so studied. And then they said, well, there's an oppressive system. And we said we open this oppressive system up because you have more media access and because you have more access from people outside. Meaning actually prisoners now have a higher possibility to get their problems to people from the outside world, to get their problems to the media, especially because on this board that we created, people from the media are sitting. So we believe actually we open the system up. They described a lot of problems that are already happening in prison. We believe they didn't bring any analysis why our policy would actually make this worse. Meaning what they would, if they would fight these problems, they would have to ban prisons, and we believe this is not possible. Ladies and gentlemen, we proved to you it is better for society, and we proved to you it is a normal practice to release prisoners earlier if social utility provided. Hence, we beg you to propose.
proposition exploits prisoners and calls it dignity. They force prisoners to trade health for freedom and call it choice. I'm going to talk to you about three things in my speech. One, on choice and dignity. Two, on justice. And third, on the practical ramifications of proposition. First, on choice and dignity. Proposition forwarded an extremely naive principle that a choice is a choice even though prisoners are subject to coercive, insidious pleasures in prison. First response, just because you are offered a reward rather than a punishment doesn't make the forces acting on you any less pernicious. If I were to offer a really poor person $1 million to work in a coal mine with no protective gear, the state still steps in and bans this. Because we believe that there is disproportionate exploitation of a vulnerable group occurring. It's bi-directional, right? If you concede that the threat of the 6 months in prison is a disproportionate influence on my decision-making matrix, then we similarly argue that the reward of the 6 months is a disproportionate influence on the prisoner's cost-benefit calculus. Second response, I'd like to point out that we do oppose paying people for drug trials, so we are principally consistent. Don't let them lie to you. Third response, a choice isn't a choice when you're culturalized into being subservient towards authority. Prison changes how you interact. You become fearful of authority. You're extremely reticent, to appear like a troublemaker. So when doctors and wardens ask a prisoner to go for a drug trial, the prisoner perceives this to be a command because of the authority structures within prisons. And there is no contradiction here, because we think whether or not, you are likely to commit crime outside of prison doesn't change the effect it has on you within prison. So there is no contradiction in this argument. So, a choice isn't a choice when you have no meaningful experience making decisions in the regimented environment of a prison, and have no ability to discuss this choice with your loved ones, an argument that was never rebutted by their team. So, proposition tried to legislate this problem away. Because first, we give them information. No, thank you. We argue that the provision of information is different from the meaningful transmission of information. We tell you that companies are going to give out 22-page consent forms, 100-page health risk booklets. They're going to have doctors in their pain who simplify the service to the point that prisoners are likely to say, you know what? I'm not going to read this information that you provided me. I'm just going to trust the doctor who tells me I have a small chance of nausea and a small chance of cardiac arrhythmia, even though I don't know what cardiac arrhythmia is. Moreover, it's how prisoners process this information and frame this information that's important. No, thank you. This takes up their argument on risk association. We're giving you the argument of immediacy bias, that I as a prisoner are able to extrapolate the benefits of being let out free early, but I as a prisoner are unable to extrapolate the health risk of opting for a drug trial. So we think this asymmetry of my extrapolational ability, no thank you, changes how I frame the data. The next thing they told us, legal recourse. You can get a lawyer, you can get a medium. First, the existence of legal channels is not the problem. The problem is that prisoners are afraid to report in the belief that their trial reduction will be reduced. No, thank you. They live in a culture where they believe that if they are troublemakers, if they stick out of the group, then the privileges will be revoked. So we disagree that people outside will do it for you. You give me a moment, man. Because prisoners are afraid of talking to the media, are afraid of appearing like a troublemaker. But before I go on, yes, ma'am.
Now, after the choice theory, would you ban payment for clinical trials outside of prison?
Yes, that's what I've been arguing all along. We only compensate you for your time. You've been very consistent. You've never told us why this is bad. Back to my argument. Proposition shifted to another principle, social utility. One, this logic of strict utilitarianism is bizarre. If I could calculate and suppose economic and social worth to society, this principle says if I kill her, so long as I pay this money back to society and double the cost, I should be allowed to go free. Second, prisoners are human beings too, not instruments for the advancement of society. Again, in parallel to your 6 months in a cellar for somebody outside prison. Because, arguably, if I threaten all of you with 6 months in the prison, right, if you don't go for a drug trial, the benefits to society will be great. But we recognize that you have human dignity too. No, their logic on strict social utility just doesn't work. It's a malformed principle that fails under scrutiny. Second key area, that was justice. We have two parallels here. First on parole. First response, no thank you. The demonstration of rehabilitation occurs during parole. My second speaker talked to you about the active versus passive distinction when engaging prisoners. That when you are given parole, you have actively demonstrated a willingness to behave well in prison. You have actively demonstrated your capacity to reform as an individual, as opposed to just having a drug trial done on you. There is no ability, no thank you, for an individual to reform in that case. Second distinction, that of discretion, that a prison warden can choose whether or not to give you parole. Your side is giving the discretion to the hands of the prisoner. You're letting the prisoner decide whether or not this exchange is valid. That's bizarre. Second parallel, plea bargaining. First distinction, right? The problem is that you aren't harmed as exclusively in plea bargaining. There are extensive witness protection programs, as my second and first speaker told you, to avoid this kind of harm. Secondly, if you so believe this is consistent with our principle, then yes, we will ban plea bargaining as well, because it might impinge on justice. We might not want to trade expediency for the sake of individual dignity. No thank you. The next thing we heard, decreasing sentence for murderers and rapists in response to our policy challenge is not significant. Two responses. One, if you say that this reduction is not significant, then your incentive structure doesn't work in the first place. That's a contradiction. No thank you. Secondly, but you're saying that they're a danger. So 3 months earlier or 3 years earlier, it's still 3 years that you're likely to hurt society. So that's still harmful. Last point on ramifications of society. Proposition presented two problems. One, a world where there are too many prisoners. Two, where there are not enough volunteers for clinical trials. We suggest that the solution is to invest in more prison infrastructure, to enhance rehabilitation programs and shorten sentences across the board, not to use prisoners as the glue to tie these two problems together. Furthermore, we argue the problem is not with the lack of volunteers. So don't let them lie to you that people will die on their side. Why? First, if the pre-trial regulation is so stringent as to have a 1 in 10,000 permissibility risk, this undermines proposition's claims that clinical trials are so crucial. It's precisely with the advent of animal testing and computer modeling that human trials have become less of a necessity. Second, instead, it is when trials are likely to be dangerous that companies will turn to prisoners. Why? One, because of less public backlash. It's easy to cover up when prisoners are hurt than an innocent member of the public. Two, because you have a cheap captive volunteer base. It's easy to get a prisoner to bear the risk of harmful drugs because the prisoner is forced to make this choice. Three, we argue that clinical trials are only safe in optimal conditions. If you and I volunteer, we should be fine. But the problem is, when you're in prison, your risk appetite increases. Prisoners are more likely to lie about their medical condition, are more likely to lie about the drugs they are taking and their allergies. So even with big data and computer modeling, you cannot account for things like the lethal interaction of drugs, something my first speaker told you, never rebutted by their side. Moreover, we argue that there wasn't medical science, because companies have a disproportionate incentive to turn to prisoners who aren't actually representative of the larger sample size in the public. If you solely minorities to test your drugs, then we argue get the consent of people outside of prison. We argue further that drugs for Ebola, hepatitis C are not hampered by your lack of volunteers, broader translational science, and the inability to come up with that formula in the first place. For all these reasons, I am incredibly proud to oppose.
That proposition got right was when they told us in their first speaker that we have a massive social problem. The problem isn't with the lack of volunteers, it's that people are willing to sacrifice their principles and dignity as and when it's convenient, as and when it's social utility. So at the end of today's debate, let's take a step back and look at the two votes we saw emerge and show what was opposition's vote that protected not just prisoners, but also society. But first, what about the vote of the proposition? In proposition's vote, prisoners were reduced to lab rats for experimentation. Prisoners were intimidated by guards and wardens on a daily basis due to the strict culture of obedience. That is what familiarization from 6 months has instilled in them. but it's okay to coerce him into volunteering for drug trials because there's social utility. In Proposition's vote, a prisoner is condemned to face 4 walls every single day. He has no friends to talk to, no family by his side. He lives a daily life of regimentation where he follows the same routine, he eats the same food, he exercises at the same time. But it's okay to silence him into volunteering for drug trials because there's social utility. In Proposition's vote, they gave prisoners legal channels which they were never going to use. They gave prisoners information which prisoners couldn't access. They gave prisoners information which they could never discuss with their family. But that is their idea of consent. But eventually in Proposition's vote, that is when they started to conceal their real awareness of the risks that this entailed. That's why, after all, we only allow prisoners to volunteer after 6 months. That's why we place a suspicious cap on the number of times you can volunteer for a drug trial. But at the end of it, that's when Proposition became evasive. Because the incentive is not that great. It's only an incentive or punishment. But at the same time, the incentive is so strong that prisoners will solve our lack of volunteers. This was a fatal tension they were never able to resolve. A rapist or murderer can't pay his way out of the justice system, but he can shorten his sentence by volunteering for a drug trial. And this was another tension present in their case. But eventually, Proposition refused to clash and respond to us when we told them that we have enough volunteers and when computer modeling was enough. So that was the price they were willing to pay. Exploitation of prisoners for nebulous benefit. What then was the vote of opposition? Recognizing that we have moved on from the dark days of prisoners being convenient tools for disposal, that's when we truly protected the dignity of prisoners. In Opposition's vote, we did not force prisoners into the unconscionable choice of lying about their medical conditions so they could volunteer for a drug trial or risk being confined by 4 walls for the rest of their life. In our vote, we were clear from our first speaker that we would never pay anyone for volunteering for drug trials. All we would do was compensate them for their time, so don't let Opposition get away with lying to you. In Opposition's vote, we refuse to tie 2 problems together because the maltreatment of prisoners cannot be used to service our whims. That's why we stood by a principle of improving all prison conditions, in reducing overcrowding for all prisoners, not only just those who are willing to volunteer for drug trials. And that is how we stood by the principle of protecting the dignity of prisoners. But even in Opposition's vote, don't let Proposition mislead you into thinking that we stifle medical process. Because in our work, because we have accurate and representative demographics, not based on the majority of prisoners, but rather from people outside of it. And that's when medicines were not only safe, but also effective. But finally, and this was a point Proposition was unwilling to clash on even by the end of today's debate, we ensure better rehabilitation and reintegration because prisoners now have to service the community sustainably and actively, and that the society was more willing to welcome them back with open arms. That's why this principle cannot fade by the end of today's debate, that we cannot allow prisoners to trade and buy their freedom with health and dignity.
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't do anything to stop the reply speaker from introducing new argumentation that didn't really take the team anywhere. But what I can make a comment on is the simple fact that to live in Singapore's world is to constantly try and win this debate by reframing it and moving it away from the central issues that exist. So I'm going to justify why we should implement this policy on 3 grounds. Necessity, I'm going to talk about choice and the prisoner, how he's invented. And then I'm also going to talk about utility, the benefits to society, and why those are justified. Again? So let's talk to this idea of necessity. They told us about animal tests. They told us about big data. Mr. Speaker, we accounted for this massively time and time again. think they also accounted for this as well when they said that, well, you can't really use big data to account for prison conditions such as real-world problems that people outside face, like drug use and taking it. So we think there is something that needs to be said about this. It's about complexity. We told you about how Microsoft surfaces through 3 terabytes of informational data every 2 seconds, and yet we still have diseases around the world. We don't think that big data is a big problem to this. And secondly, we also told you that if big data is so efficacious, we don't think that there's any real danger to the people who are testing this medication. So we think that the efficacy of this medication poses no threat to the prisoner. So we don't think that there's any rational problem with the prisoner going for these drug trials in the worlds that they set up where big data rules overall. They told us under this idea of wider society. And we told you that, well, the criminal justice system is not being changed here. We're not introducing anything new. We're just simply advancing the aims of social utility. They then went and told the team line that they're going to ban trials outside of prison. Mr. Speaker, the reason we have to do things like pay people is a simple fact, it's about incentives. That's why we introduced this policy. Fisiwa told you this when she was setting it up, that the reason we give people time off is so that they feel the need in order to go out. So the question under this is the provision of a benefit equal to coercion? I have an example to illustrate why this is, but I'm going to say it after this analysis. Mr. Speaker, we don't think that this is true because the prisoner isn't going to suffer a fate worse than the one that they're going to live in a time where they don't subject themselves to anything, okay? So, if I give you a donut and then provide another donut as a necessary condition for you to eat it, we don't think that this is tantamount to coercion. We think what is tantamount to coercion is holding a gun to your head and saying, eat the donut, and then that is coercion. Why? Because there's a negative harm that exists if you don't choose. And this negative harm goes beyond where we started, and now you're dead and you're still not alive. So we think that they needed to engage us with what is the problem with this idea just a little bit more. So then they told us, under this idea of prison condition, that you become fearful. 80% of all juveniles in the American prison system are recidivists. We don't think that if they became fearful, they'd go back and do the crimes again. So let's talk about wide society. They talked about medicine, and they said that, well, we're going to have bad tests. We think that we won't because they're easier to watch. And we think that it's easier to maintain things like good nutrition and ensuring that you rest enough. So we think you're actually going to get better medication. Then they also told you about how society is going to benefit from the cost of this. We're passing down the lower costs down to the consumer. So even the person who suffers from cancer, who suffers from Alzheimer's, and yet is not a prisoner and couldn't take part in the trial, is going to benefit from cheaper medication. Mr. Speaker, this idea of Ebola, we think that what they said was that, well, we haven't been able to prove the efficacy of Ebola. Under their standards, we actually have because they conducted animal tests. The reason we haven't been able to use them is because we haven't conducted human trials, and for very good reason, which is what I'm going to state as I move on. We think that it's very, very important for legal standards to ensure that you guarantee that the efficacy of a pill doesn't only work on a few rats or primates, but works on humans. The last thing that they told us was this idea of how can you allow someone to buy their own freedom? We think that rich people can buy their freedom if they take part in the drug trials. We don't have a problem with this. So because our policy is better for the prisoner, it's better for society, and it's better for medicine, we beg Mr. Speaker.
So first of all, thank you everyone for really engaging. We had a nice debate. We all enjoyed it. We felt that there were moments in the debate where the engagement was really good and where the debate was really close. And I think that reflects in what is a split panel decision. What I'm going to do in this oral adjudication is to take you through what we felt were the 3 core issues in the debate, describe what we felt were the most important clashes under those issues, and then take you through where we fell on each. The first issue in this debate was an issue of justice. What are the aims of the criminal justice system and how do those interact with this notion, this model? From proposition, we had primarily a negative frame analysis which aimed to show that this model doesn't detriment the ends of justice. And from the opposition, we had a converse framing, trying to show that the model has a positive harm, if that makes sense, to the aims of criminal justice. And that framing meant that there was something of a disjoint in the ways in which the teams approached the criminal justice system. The second issue was the issue of choice and consent. Whether or not this was a true choice, and how we could evaluate that. From from side proposition, we had the idea of a distinction between reward and punishment, and the idea that these sorts of rewards and incentives reflect in the status quo all of the time. And from opposition, we had an idea of both positive rewards and negative punishments, both reflecting as coercion in making this kind of decision, and the idea that they in fact opposed all of those types of coercion, and added to that the specific circumstances of a prison, brutality of the prison environment, the uselessness of the type of information that the prisoners will be receiving, an inability to access legal recourse, and a prison culture that inculcates obedience, tying it to the specifics of this notion. The third and final issue then was one of utility and drug trials. And this is primarily where I want to turn to how we saw the debate form. We felt that there was something of a lack of engagement, particularly from side proposition, on the level of principle in this debate. Much of the principles that side proposition tried to argue were tied to utility. They were tied to the social benefit of the motion, and that utility was what the side proposition justified the motion. The ideas of justice similarly were tied to utility. We can do this if we get some kind of a social benefit, with examples like plea bargaining. Where that really harmed side proposition strategically was that we felt that side opposition were engaging on two levels. They were engaging on the level of utility, showing that there was not, in fact, any social benefit to this. Firstly, because the problem in the status quo was overstated by proposition, that there were alternative solutions to the problem, and that the social benefit, at the very least, would be marginal. But secondly, that they were arguing principles that were independent of that social utility. They were arguing principles of consent and exploitation and harm, which they said were unjustified even if we somehow benefited from medical drug trial. And because we thought that a lot of their choice of consent analysis in that second clash that I described, specifically with regard to the circumstances within a prison environment and the actor of the prisoner involved, a lot of that went unengaged with. We felt that on both levels, they managed to show by the end of the debate that there was a very limited utility to this motion, but that regardless of that, the principle, the motion was unacceptable on a purely principled basis. And because side proposition was so tied down to social utility in this debate, we felt that on a majority